We don't have to conform to the pattern of, the church world. We can be transformed.
And peacekeeping, I think, looks a lot more like maintaining the status quo. And Jesus calls us to peacemaking.
I told you justice will cost you everything, but so will doing nothing.
Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Kanan Hurst, and this is episode 7, Kingdom Justice Part 2. In this episode, we pick up right where we left off with Michelle Warren from episode 6 to continue our discussion about how the small church can humbly and effectively seek justice for the poor and oppressed among us. Yeah, I mean, when I first learned about this stuff in college, my senior year, I have to confess, in response to learning about my privilege, I reacted, I can't even say response, in the reaction of learning about and believing that I had privilege, seeing evidence of that in a variety of different ways, mostly from the teachers and professors that I had. I reacted in the most privileged way possible. My sinful desire, prideful nature, wanting to be at the forefront of telling this stuff, I immediately sought fights out with my family members.
That sounds like a 22-year-old, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Give yourself a little grace.
I was like, I'm going to go fight this out because no one else knows this stuff in my circles. And I got so much gross pleasure out of butting heads and making drama from this. And I was using the movement for my own gain. And I had gracious friends and people were like, dude.
So I'm not gonna shame you for that, because when our eyes are opened, there's a level of betrayal that happens. And some of that anger comes from, how could you hide such an awful reality from me? The thing is that there's blindness way before us, so some of it wasn't they were hiding, is that there's blind too,
of course, yeah.
And so I think blindness to a little bit more sight, there's this level of anger, this level of betrayal, and there's this emotion. And I think that awakening is also another reason I wrote some of this book, was the movement does not start at the moment you become aware. And it's okay if your awareness is this shock and outrage. But that's an initial response. The maturing response, is to actually do inward reflection and to hold yourself and your community accountable. There's two things that, I'm trying to, in addition to literally understanding the heart of God's justice and not minimizing it as a bedrock of our literal Christian theology. And I will go toe to toe with anybody on that one. Not because I like fighting. I actually don't. I just am so convinced that that is the foundation of God's throne. I mean, something about David saying righteousness and justice. I mean, I know it was metaphoric, but that is the heart of God. Right. So I would definitely do that. But if in addition to the discipleship aspect of that and how we invest, how should we posture ourselves? If people could just posture themselves in a curious, maybe it's only just one thing, a curious place, I think we'd get there a little bit farther. So one is, I always just say humility, but that do justice, love mercy, walk humbly thing. I really love the prophet, Micah. I'm glad he said that. I wish he had started with humble. I'm going to tell you, we're going to need some serious justice to move barriers. I mean, this is pushing boulders up mountain stuff. Right. And loving mercy isn't just responding to a problem and, giving to the poor. It is, but it's also actually giving grace to the person who doesn't agree with you. It's constantly forgiving the person who irritates you and has a different ideology and culture. Like I'm thinking back just your 22-year-old self. Loving mercy means I'm okay with you wearing certain, garb that speaks completely against, where I'm at. And just I want to be careful that I don't share too many illustrations because I don't want to be polarizing. But just to say, I am a polarizing person. But anyway, just to say that, loving mercy is really important. But if we started with walking humbly, everything would look different. And the reason I say curious, Brene Brown has done a lot of work in the sociology and psychology of shame and empathy. So all humans experience emotion. It doesn't matter who you are. You can be rich, poor. We just got emotion.
Yeah.
And being able to identify each other's emotion and connecting to the emotion, not the experience, but the emotion is where we have common human bonds. So whether I'm a privileged person or not, I have the ability I know what it means to be sad. I know what it means to be happy. I know what it means to be broke. Like all of the many myriads. Empathy enables me to connect to your emotion regardless of my shared experience.
Right.
And that's where bridges are built.
Right.
Here's the problem, is that shame keeps you from being empathetic. Shame keeps you from being curious. Guilt and shame are different. Guilt means I did something wrong. I know exactly what I did, or maybe I don't, but I actually did something very specific, and I feel guilty about what I did. I can easily repair that by saying, I'm sorry. Racism, this really big, scary idea, injustice, all the things that we don't want to see, speak, or hear.
Yeah.
Shame is not, I didn't do a specific, if I did, I need to know so I can say I'm sorry. Shame is this whole cloud that says I am a bad person. And what happens when we are greeted with appropriate accusations of racism, the reason a lot of times white people will say, well, I never owned any slaves, is because they don't identify that they're dealing with this overall shame that somehow white people are bad. We need to deal with our guilt. We need to deal with our shame so that we can actually be empathetic and curious. So Brene Brown talks a lot about this in Dare to Lead. And just that the number one thing that's going to break down our empathy and our ability is shame. And so I feel like we just don't even get to that. So it's like, well, don't talk to me about my privilege. Don't tell me I'm a racist. Because I'm so enveloped with this shame that somehow I'm a bad person.
Yeah.
That I can't even deal with it.
I can't even deal with
I can't even
another
deal
thing.
with it.
Yeah.
Because my mom's mad at me. My kids think I'm a loser. My husband and I it's just too much. Yeah. Here's the thing is back to that Genesis 3. So when everything that was good became broken, what was Adam and Eve's first response when their eyes were open to the fact that they had done things that were wrong, that maybe they weren't so good? What did they do?
They realized their nakedness and protected themselves.
And then they hid from God. So they covered themselves and they hid. So I would say if I was going to ask us, when we look at the evil, what are we going to do with the evil in the world? Be curious about it. Recognize you can connect to it. Don't be so worried about your own shame that you hide.
That's an identity issue. Do we actually believe we're forgiven, loved children of God? And if we do, then information that tells us how we've participated in ugliness, how we can help, should actually motivate us. Oh, thank you for telling me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember having a conversation with a friend of color many years ago, and I don't remember what made me say this, but I said it so quickly. And like I said, I don't remember the total dialogue of it, but I was like, oh, well, you have to understand there's 2 cardinal rules to being white. I was like, you can't be broken, you can't be broken. So and like I said, it kind of blurted it out, but I thought, wow, that is absolutely true. We're taught
true.
as white people, like, we better not lose our, if you can't make it financially, it's because you did not wake up and work. You were born into you got a certain level of income, you got to, you got to maintain it. Otherwise you're a loser.
Yeah.
There's a whole world that doesn't have that. So one, you can't be
Right.
broke. That's a shame. That's embarrassing.
Wow.
And you can't be broken, especially if you know Jesus. Like, seriously. You got your Bible study books, you got your small groups, you got your, I sponsor kids, I volunteer in my church. I mean, I'm not broken. And so we spend so much of our time avoiding being broken that's some of the shame piece. That's some of the, we resist humility. We resist curiosity. We don't even want to know what somebody who is in a different socioeconomic or a different racial identity, because we're so worried about appearing broken. If you look at, especially, I don't think men really identify with this in their posts, but there's a whole network of women's Bible studies and conferences within the Christian church that talk about identity and self-worth. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't want to get into patriarchy in the church, but I'm just saying, like, we spend so much time even in our own hub that we don't get to this place of, I really am willing to be curious and humble. I need to hold myself so I'm not broke or broken, because then I will be shamed by my people.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Well, we're actually talking about status quo.
Yeah.
We are trained, I think it's a natural human behavior to become complacent, to feel like you can't make a difference, that I'm just going to survive, that the status quo, I mean, this is not just a 100-year problem. The status quo has been a problem since, the beginning. Amos, I love Amos's, it's another very popular, that justice and righteousness would flow down like a river. It's actually not quite that river and mighty stream that I'm giving a, righteousness is one, justice is the other, but it would be this river, that it would be this easy cascade. I mean, there's nothing more easy than watching a river flow downstream.
Right.
And Amos is like projecting this beautiful picture that righteousness and justice, the things the way God wanted, the way he, in his goodness, created them to be, that they would be like that.
Yeah.
That the status quo would be righteousness and justice. But it's not. And that's why Amos and the other prophets are like, and that is why we have to resist until that is the status quo. We do the work of resistance. And it's in that resistance, like, well, I don't know if I trust the voice of resistance. I don't know if I trust something that's against the status quo. I succeed.
Yeah.
Not everybody succeeds, though. Kenan, you and I succeed. Our communities have succeeded if I maintain the status quo. Here's the thing is, it would have been a whole lot easier for me if I had just stayed in my community and I had
Become an engineer.
Well, I could have been an engineer, but then at like 30, decided to marry and have kids and leave engineering, because I'm a woman. I'm an evangelical woman. So I'm going to be one of the most overeducated, underutilized voices and bodies in the church. Okay.
Yeah.
So it would have been better if I just had married well, and I did marry well, but I married up, but he done got money, and his call is very, we are married with this very distinct call, but it'd have been a whole lot easier for me. It'd have been easier for my kids. It'd have been easier for literally everyone in my family and society in general if Michelle just had behaved and accommodated social norms and just was a Sunday school. And Sunday school teachers are good. So that I'm not speaking poorly, but if she just had married well, stayed in her suburban community, went to a mega church, did her Bible study on Tuesday, volunteered to help the homeless a few times a month. Like, why does she have to push it?
That's a question. Like, you're already doing enough, you're already spraying Roundup on the weeds that are coming.
But I want to know, why does
sidewalk.
the dirt, what's happening in the dirt that would allow a weed to even flourish?
Exactly.
And it could be the mathematician and the strategist, philosophical logic person. But I always keep going back, because we talked about mercy as a response to a problem, but justice says, how do we get there? And you will continue to go farther and farther up that hill. Like, where did we go here? Where do we go here? Like, why is that dirt not allowing that seed to flourish here, and it's allowing it to flourish there? Do we condemn the seed? Do we condemn the soil? I mean, like, these are questions we have to be willing to ask.
Yeah.
And even if you're not a person who's going to ask, maybe read some people who are asking those questions. Like, again, I don't want to be on my watch known for, she covered her eyes to the pain of the world. She covered her ears to the cry. She kept her mouth silent because it went better for her and for her kids and for her life if she just kept her mouth shut and allowed the status quo of conformity to continue. And I understand it's mind-numbing to be in the waters of conformity. It is painful to stand up and resist. It is exhausting. And sometimes I want to let the waters just overtake me, and just kind of go back because it's such a tiring work. And I was such a good girl. I'm not a rebel. I never have been a rebel. I don't do this work out of rebellion. I do this work out of obedience. Yeah. Obedience to Christ, who basically said he was reconciling all things to himself. And he said, come to me, you who are weary, you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And it's not the rest of this conformity to the status quo. It is finally, you will not be hungry. You will not be thirsty for justice. So go back to that justice and righteousness. Blessed are those who are starving and thirsty for righteousness, they will be filled. And when you look at that beatitude and you think of righteousness is not about personal piety. Right. If you go to tzedakah, which is the Hebrew word for righteousness, it talks about the rightness of how people act in relation to each other. Decide that basically our right acts become justice. The reason you see righteousness and justice parallel is because it's imperative that to do right means that we're working towards the rightness, to the justice, to the tzedakah and mishpat of our societies. And when our eyes are open and we realize, oh my goodness, it's so bad. And we weep and we grieve and we lament, but then we join Christ and we join his work in the world. We are so comforted. Blessed are you who recognize that you or would be willing to be hungry and thirsty for justice, because the end of that beatitude is a promise. Yeah. Blessed you won't be hungry, you won't be thirsty anymore. So it doesn't even say, blessed are you who feed the hungry. I mean, you do need to do that, but it's just like, recognize.
So beautiful. So with small churches, we've got, as you well know, especially small churches with out people of privilege or who are struggling with budget or bivocational, work. I mean, all the things. Drama, volunteers, disagreements, the list goes on and on.
Mm-hmm. That's church work. Yep.
It's church work. It's church work. And I'm going to assume a lot of people listening are saying, okay, I believe you. This is the work of the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. How do I start or continue to partner with good justice seeking work that's already happening in my community or in a place close by? I mean, we're still so segregated in housing because of all sorts of policies, right? So there are lots of churches that are in privileged areas with a lot of that are homogenous, right? Racially, culturally, socioeconomic status. How do I, as a pastor there or a member of a church there, recognize and engage without money, without a ton of people?
I will just say this. We all are a part of an enormous church, the Big C Church. And, some of us have expressions in our locale that is small, some it is big. And I think we have to be willing to ask ourselves, why are we even coming together? Like, what's our purpose? And if it is, we just want to kind of do big in church and small church kind of look the same. We do sing the same songs. We, have the same structure to our services. I will say this, as a small church, it's really hard to keep up with that like how we're going to get the videos and the slides, and we do everything in a couple different languages. And I was a worship pastor for many years, and we were doing things in 4 languages, just a lot of how do we kind of play the game so that we can check off the box of church. So I would say what's nice about a small congregation, if you're not trying to do church, but you're asking questions of being the church, I think we also go down to the roots of whose shoulders do we stand on. And I think what was so powerful about the Acts church and the early church, by the way, they didn't do it the same way. They were coming together and bearing one another's burdens, of course. They were ostracized, but they were literally meeting the needs of society. And they were trying to figure out, how do we love the poor? How do we care for the broken? How do we rescue the dying? I mean, that's why we see, even to this day, a lot of our hospitals, their roots were from the church. A lot of our schools, and I don't know if you know this, but if you weren't in America a white boy, you didn't get an education. And you see the church educating indigenous. Of course, there's a lot with Indian schools and Christian. I mean, I don't even want to, there's a very disgusting legacy that I'm not speaking about, but I'm thinking of one particular priest in Detroit who started schools for girls, for the poor, for, indigenous tribes. And so you see, out of my faith, I want to make sure that everybody has access to education. I want to make sure that everybody has access to health care, and things have changed, but I would just challenge small churches, before you kind of get into the trapping, is why are you even gathering? And it's not like, are you small because you want to be small, or are you small because you're just not great? This is sort of a pushback on me too. And how can we really evaluate our purpose for gathering and what is God commissioning us to? And maybe instead of having a series of, a preaching series and trying to do it, maybe we're spending weeks of lament and discerning. And there's no one formulatic thing. But I just want to challenge myself. I want to challenge those of us who have the flexibility to get off the rat race of church, to ask those hard questions. What's our purpose? I think COVID actually forced us a little bit of that. A lot of churches closed during COVID because they weren't sure why they were gathering. And some actually did it as protest. Well, we're going to gather without masks, and we want to sing every germ. And that's the reason you're gathering? I would just challenge, why are we even gathering? What is our function of church? We are seeing, especially younger millennial and Gen Zs, and for good reason, people are leaving the Christian church in America en masse. And I personally think it's because our public witness is in shambles. Why would I want to use my Sunday morning or, whatever time to, so I think we really need to ask ourselves, God, will you give us a vision to see the evil? Again, will you give us the vision to hear it? And will you give us, the courage to speak it and to speak the truth? So I don't think the only way, are we going to be churches of peace? The only way I think we're going to move forward is through truth telling and repair. What we were talking about earlier, about really being honest about what's going on and how do we join the restorative work that is happening in the world as agents of salt and light. And those kinds of questions could have incredibly radical consequences, but also impacts as well. So that's probably not the right answer, because there are strategies. You can go to this city council meeting, and I think that there's a part of it, but laying down the 4 walls of the church is a really important step. That's a huge barrier. One, internally, we've got to lay those walls down, knowing that anybody's going to come in and through, right?
Right.
And then the second thing is what is our agenda? What is our purpose for gathering? Is there space to talk about how we're in the world and how we're making a difference? Is that what some of our conversations are? Are we, studying God's word and praying for what concerns?
Right.
And how can God expand our vision and ears and all of those senses to really see what's happening, the honest reckoning, and ask God, how would you want me to work towards the work of repair? And I will say,
It's different in so many different contexts.
It is. It is. And I certainly don't want anybody to shut down. I think God is very gracious and kind. And it is overwhelming. I'm just gonna say that. But that's why we just really need to be dependent. God, I don't have the resources to be able to impact the world the way you want to. Thank you that you're already doing it, whether I join you or not. Help me to be able to have the eyes of you. Help me to be willing to be brave and listen to that pain. Help me to be dependent on you to, be my comfort and to really be my light in the midst of darkness, and help me have courage to be in the darkness.
We need to be satisfied with layered, slow, complex answers, and they're not really.
I thought you were going to say work, but I agree. In both.
Yeah, exactly. Work, the work, like the answer is not, here is the work you have to do. Sometimes it's like, okay, what can I do in 2022? What tell me or let me seek out. There's a march going on for immigrants or, whatever it is, that's important. But yeah, the answers we're looking for clean cut, which gives a lot of white folks the permission to say, well, I don't know. I wasn't ever given here are the steps.
What's so crazy is we weren't and we were, right? So that's part of it is, as a white person, I'm like, okay, I've got my task list and things that I've got to do. And now I'm going to include justice because Kanan and Michelle decided to put this on a podcast. And now I feel a little bad, or I already was doing it. And now I'm going to add overcoming injustice to my new timeline and my checklist as though it could be accomplished. Here's the problem is when you're kind of doing your daily sort of proverbial walking down the street and you are on this agenda to serve God, to love your neighbors, you pack your life in such a way that you don't really have time for anything except that. And it can seem so noble and good. And we actually have been shown a better way for it. We've been told that we're supposed to love God, love our neighbors with, love your neighbors as yourself with all your soul, with all, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And that command was highlighted. I mean, that's beginning of the law, but it was really highlighted and a picture was painted very beautifully in the New Testament when, by the way, I've got one coming into my life through marriage, but I have 4 kids, 3 biological kids. And then I've got an adopted Nicaraguan son. I'm going to be a mother-in-law in the next year. 3 of those 5 are lawyers. They're all young lawyers. And so in the parable of the rich young lawyer that goes to Jesus and says, hey, I'm going to try to test you. I feel like I just want to point that out, that's how young lawyers are. They want to test you. So this young lawyer comes in to Jesus and says, tell me which is the greatest commandment. Jesus says, you tell me. And the young punk, go back and forth. And so finally he's like, well, this is the right answer, to love God, blah, gives the answer. And then Jesus is like, yeah, you know the answer. You're so smart. And then the lawyer, just because he's young enough and wants to push a little bit, says, yeah, but who's my neighbor? And then Jesus spins the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I want to go back to that checklist. I've got my list because I'm a Levite. I'm a priest. I'm on a road. I'm going from A to B, and I got my agenda, and I got even after listening to this podcast, I know where I'm going. And now there's this annoying, half-dead, beaten-up person on the side of the road. Like, dude, I got work to do. It's good work, man. I'm a Levite. I'm a priest.
Yeah.
And what does Jesus say? He lifts up the Samaritan, saying, you know what? Your checklist doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You need to stop, and you need to see the evil.
Yeah.
You need to touch it. You need to be gritty. You need to dirty yourself with the blood, the sweat, the pain, and then stay in it so long that you begin to realize no road should exist where people are left half dead and beaten up on the side of the road.
Right.
That's really what we're talking about. What does it look to like to love God? It's a long, disruptive, interruptive work.
Yep.
And it's not for the rich in spirit who have added that checklist of now I love God, I love my neighbor, I'm a good Pharisee, and this is what it looks like to do those. God, I'm so sorry. Will you help me understand how to love so that I am ready and so that I'm not so full with what I'm doing to achieve
Yeah.
and to acquire, but that I have movement and the ability to get really, really dirty for you.
Maybe the blessings in our lives are the distractions of needs that we never saw coming, instead of the money to build the buildings that
Oh,
we always
100%.
wanted.
Oh, yeah. Oh, 100%. And that's what I was saying. I mean, like I said, I don't want to make small churches more noble, but than big churches, but I want to say you have a unique spot to be innovative and to not try to keep up with the Joneses of ministry. There's a freedom. There's a freedom. And maybe, and I probably would challenge those of us in small churches. Are we just trying to make a big church?
Yeah.
Or are we trying to say, you know what, we have this ability to adapt, and what is God doing? Like, we don't have to conform to the pattern of, the church world. We can be transformed. We can allow God's, word and this new opening to renew our minds, and so that we can kind of test what God's will is for us.
Yeah. And like you said, why are we meeting? If we're not meeting to expand the kingdom of God, which Jesus has laid out very clearly, caring for the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed, then what are we doing? Are we trying to build a big church? Are we trying to get where we can hire more people? I mean, that's not a bad thing. If that's
It's
what
not
God
a bad thing at all.
gives you,
No, of course, that's not a
great,
bad thing.
work with it.
I don't think pastors who started, big churches didn't start from being big. They usually start from being small. And there's just so much scandal in the church, the white evangelical church today. I just say beware. I don't want us to give up on the church. I don't want us to give up on who Christ is and what he can do through in mass of his people. I'm just saying that there's trappings there are trappings that when you are small, you've got to be careful that you don't try. And I have been a part of congregations that are very content to, be very present with the poor. And then I have been, I've been in a couple congregations, small churches, and one that has been very disgruntled, and that was very hard for me. It's just like, we're disgruntled because we think if we have this right song or we have this right moment, that people are going to come in and we're going to build a kingdom to ourselves. And I'm like, that's disgusting. That's really not the whole purpose. The community is lost and dying around us, and you're just trying to curate a place for you to preach. That's embarrassing. Now, let me just say this. I like good preaching. I am a preacher, so I do enjoy, it. I'm a worship leader, so I love to not only sing, but I love to, cultivate and lead worship. And I hope that we as a church continue to challenge each other through the way we are reading the Bible. I don't ever want to lose that. I think, in my book, I talk a lot about the power of singing songs of resistance. And I think that's really a mark of humanity, but I also think the people of God, who sings at a funeral? Oh, Christians, because we are taking our grief and shifting our greatest grief for a vision of what can be, this hope of what. And so we sing of this hope, and we sing of what can be. And these songs in the midst of darkness and struggle are a defining witness. So I do think that we need to be coming together to encourage each other in song and in word, but not to forget in the deed, in the action.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for being on. I think what I've gleaned is maybe the thing that should set the church apart. We're talking, well, we're different. We should be set apart. So we're not going to engage in these things. Maybe the thing that sets us apart is our willingness to hold tension, to hold lament, to not silo ourselves and just be angry at other humans, but to be willing to have our shared emotional response to things, our shared humanity with others, kind of connect us and unify us. It's a lot more comfortable to be on social media and talk about how these other people are doing it wrong.
It's always easier to blame somebody else than to look inward. I mean, it's brave. It is a brave work to move beyond even tears of guilt and shame and do the necessary work of solidarity and repair. And I'm still learning too.
Yeah.
It's hard to write a book when you're always in the process of forming.
Yeah. One thing you say is Fall on your face if you have to.
Oh, please do. Just keep trying. Get up. Get up. It's
And get
brave.
up.
Keep doing it. Keep
Totally.
doing it.
And,
Because you know what, Kenan? It's expensive if we don't do it too. You know, I told you justice will cost you everything, but so will doing nothing.
Yeah.
I think another thing is when you're privileged, and I know we're wrapping up, is be willing to recognize. You have to be willing to recognize this is not a work done in your lifetime. That's why we should be encouraged by Hebrews 11 that has all of those people of faith who were credited for living by faith because they died before what they hoped for happened. You know, and then in Hebrews 12, it talks about this cloud of witnesses, and there's a cloud of witnesses that still is, you know, ever being, you know, cultivated to this day, that this is a long work of restoration. The work of restoration, I believe, is the work of the kingdom. This is a slow work that is not dependent on one generation. But I will say that history will look back and ask us how we stewarded our work. And as I look at what we're doing, this is my biggest concern. And this is sort of my clarion call. The hand that is writing our history needs to be forced in a different direction because history will not remember us well.
Yeah.
And I mean people who look like you and me.
Right. Right.
Let's force that hand. And let's quit being the worst white liberals or the white Christian moderate.
Yeah. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Michelle. That was amazing.
Thank you, Kenan.
Parish Podcast is a production of Vineworks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Kanan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Erica Creasel. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.